is that he's saying and how he's saying it this morning. You know, in the previous lesson here, which was Daniel chapters 1, you know, as it was written for the people that was in the process of reconfiguring their identity. What had happened in Daniel chapters 1, we talked about that the Hebrew children, or the Israelites from Judah, had been taken into captivity into Babylon, and that they were going to be down there for a period of 70 years there. And so it was kind of changing their identity, because what happened was the king of the Babylonians had taken the best and the brightest of the children of Israel and brought them into Babylon to convert them, or basically that's what they were doing, because he was saying that they would be in training for a period of 3 years. So they was converting them over to their way of living, their way of seeing things, their way of lives there. And so that happens, is still happening even today. People are being taken from one society into another society and being converted, their mind thought. That's all they really was doing, was changing their thought pattern. And so here we remember that Daniel, which was about 15 years old at the time, they give that time frame, at the time that he went down into Babylon, and along with the other 3 Hebrew boys as well. And so therefore, there was a possibility, when you're talking about someone that young going into another culture, they could lose their identity. But Daniel, and we know that Daniel did possess the ability to talk to people. He had that calming effect. He could relay his message well. And so they must, have been wondering, does God still cares about his people? When we're down, when we're going through, sometimes we ask that question. And I guess it's okay to ask the question, because there's an answer there. And so the question was, does God still care about his people? Even today we can ask the same question. Do God still care about us? Yeah. Do God still care about his people? We're going through. Mr. Short here was in the hospital there a couple of days ago. And I'm sure at some point, as he said this morning, he said, I thank God that I was there, now I'm here, that God has delivered me from that hospital. Not that it's a bad place, right, but it's not a place that we always enjoy being at. And so God does care, and God is there, and he's truly in control of the nations, not only just the individual people, but he's in control of the nations. We look at TV, and we talked about some of the things that was going on TV as we was getting prepared this morning, and we talked about world events and stuff. Believe it or not, God is in control of world events. See, we tend to see things in a very narrow thing. We're looking at it minute by minute, whereas God is looking at it over an extended period of time, over centuries, And that's what was happening here with Nebuchadnezzar and in this lesson here. And so, as we talk about dreams, and that's what this lesson here is kind of getting about, a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had there. And Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and it bothered him. It really bothered him. Because, when I first kind of read through this, I thought it said he had a dream. But it didn't say, it put an S on it. In the English language, there's an S on that dream, which means it's plural. That means it's more, he had that dream more than once. It's kind of like we going to bed, and if you eat too many of them pig feet or whatever, and lay down, you're gonna have nightmares, as they say it. But the thing about this was that Nebuchadnezzar had this dream repeatedly, and it was such a strong, influential dream that it took away his sleep. He couldn't go back to sleep. He couldn't rest. It bothered him. And so that's where we kind of pick this up here. And please do understand the difference. There's a difference between a dream and a vision. Understand that in this lesson here, Daniel prayed to God before he went to meet with Nebuchadnezzar, and he had a vision. Right. The difference between the dream and a vision. A dream is merely what your mind have in it, and it grabs the little bits and pieces of it and put it together. And because your mind ain't sleep, your mind is wide awake while you resting and sleeping, but the mind is still running there. But a vision is something that comes from God, that is delivered and it's shut for a specific point there in life there. So that's important that we understand that. So one of the things that we have to understand is that as students of the Word this morning, that God can customize and reveal his revelations to each of the different cultures. So he can, even in this lesson here today, this lesson may have been set back in, what is it, around 590, 506, 560 BC. It actually is applicable to us even today. This lesson here is revealing, is applicable to us today. And it's also understand that we must keep in mind or be reminded that God's view of every situation is much wider than ours. Yeah. What God sees is much bigger than what we're going to be able to see. Mm-hmm. So let us take a moment here and get into the Word here, a little bit, go into the Word of God here this morning. Because the lesson, I have to go back to my Bible, and I'm going to read you the King James Version this morning. And it says this here, and starting with verse 1 of chapters 2 of the book of Daniel. And in the second year of the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep was breaking from him, or his sleep was taken away from him. And verse 2, then the king commanded to call the magicians, the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, to show the king his dream, so that they could and they came and stood before the king. In other words, he would call all of his best magicians and astrological people. And because one thing, if you go back and you kind of research Babylonian history there, you find that they was really into trying to predict the future. They wanted to know what the future held. Right. You know, like a lot of people used to go see the Red Hand Lady, yeah. What they call them, the fortune teller. Fortune teller. Now, you never go to, people don't go to the fortune tellers because they want to know their past. The only reason they go to the fortune teller or the Red Hand Lady or whatever is because they want to know the future. They're trying to figure out what tomorrow is going to bring. And so that was a big thing with the Babylonians. They was into trying to read the astrology and wanted to know what was tomorrow bringing. Back to the Word of God, people. Thank you. And so the king, verse 2 again. Then the king commanded to call the magicians, and the astrologers, and the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans, to show the king his dream, so they came and they stood before the king. Verse 3, and the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king, in Shadrach, O king, live forever. Tell thy servant the dream, and we will show the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If ye will not make known unto me my dream with the interpretation, therefore ye shall be cut to pieces, and your houses shall be made dunghill. In other words, here the king is a very impatient man, whether you realize it as you read this thing, because he's telling all of his magicians and astrologers and sorcerers and all of these people, tell me what I dreamed. And then tell me the interpretation of the dream. He's making it really tough for him. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, it says that the dream had gone from him. So that kind of leads me to believe that either he was testing his magicians or astrologists and all these other people as to really how good are you,
right.
Or B, he had dreamed the dream, it bothered him, but you ever have a dream and you really can't remember what it was about? And that could have been the case there. But either way, the king kind of put him in a hard position here. The king really told him, said, I want you, Mr. Smith, to tell me what I dreamed last night and what did it mean. That's what I want you to do. And if you don't do it, as they said in that movie with the little kids, said, off with your heads. I'm going to kill you. And not only am I going to kill you, I'm going to go over there and burn your house down too. Cut you into pieces and destroy your house, turn it into a dunghill. So now, the standard is very high. The kingdom set the standard really high. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't playing. So the Chaldeans say, "Hey, look at here, king. That's a hard task you're gonna put us to." Verse 6 goes on to say, "But if you show the dream and in the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards of great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and the interpretation thereof." Verse 7, "Then answered again and said, Let the king tell his servants the dream." This is the magicians and the Chaldeans and all saying, "Hey, tell us the dream and we can interpret it. And we will show the interpretation of it." And the king, verse 8 says, "The king answered and said, I know this of certainty that you will gain the time." In other words, you playing me for time. That's what you're doing. You're playing for time here. Because you see, the thing is gone from me. In other words, the dream, I had the dream, but it's gone from me. I don't know, I can't really put my finger on it. I can't really understand what it was I dreamt. How, and so you can, but it's bothering me.
Right.
And so I don't know if any of us ever been in that predicament where we had a situation where something was on our hearts, on our minds, but you weren't 100% sure what it was. Sometimes you like people, you hear them say, "I woke up and I was so worried, and things is just bothering me." And a lot of times when I lay there, or if I can't rest, I talk to God about it. I just talk to God, and I said, since I ain't sleep, God, I'm gonna keep you awake too. But then again, we eventually I wake up the next morning and say, well, I guess you must put me back to sleep. But here in verse 9, it goes on to say, "If you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you." There's but one decree. I ain't but one way for y'all to go this morning. And that is, for you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you show me the interpretation thereof. In other words, tell me the dream, and that way I'll know what you're talking about.
Right.
You ain't getting up there doing a shucking and dance and jive here this morning. That was the impossible demand that Nebuchadnezzar was putting forth before his magicians and everybody. So at this point, it was looking kind of bad for all the magicians, because Nebuchadnezzar went ahead and told them, said, "Look, if you can't interpret the dream, it seems like to me y'all can't, because you're up here shucking and jiving and making putting on a good show, but you ain't saying that. You ain't bringing no interpretation here. So I ain't got time for this morning. I ain't feeling it. So I'm going to go ahead and have y'all put to death. All of you magicians, all of you sorcerers, all of you astrologers in the nation of Babylon, off with your head."
So what you're saying is, if he can't tell the dream, then he can't interpret it.
That's right. And so, and that, you know, here what the king was saying was that, okay, anybody can come up and say, this is what the dream means. If I come here and tell you, oh man, last night I dreamed about some water.
Yeah.
I dreamed like the water was just running everywhere. And then you said, oh yeah, man, that means it's finna rain.
Yeah.
Or that means that if you go to the dream book and look up water, these jokers got these lottery numbers, they can hook you up with them. If you look at that and say, oh, you dreamed about water, so you dreaming about number 67 in the lottery book. Don't, Facebook audience, I'm not into interpreting dreams and I'm not into playing the lottery. But what I am saying is that if I give you part of the answer, then it's easier for you to come up with the other part of the answer. But here, King Nebuchadnezzar wasn't giving them anything.
Right.
He wasn't cutting no slack. He was just saying, if you can't tell me my dream and tell me the interpretation, then you are useless.
That's right.
You know. And so that's basically what he said. So here they found themselves kind of in a hopeless situation there. Nebuchadnezzar and his astrologers called the Chaldeans, in the King James Version here, that's what they would call the Chaldeans in the King James Version, but it was actually astrologers. They was engaged in a high-stakes standoff here. The astrologers claimed to have the power to speak for the gods, little g. But the king had the power to put them to death if they failed to fail the test of their abilities. So on one hand over here, you got somebody that's saying, oh, we're speaking for the gods of this and that, of Babylon. But the king over here saying, I'm going to put you to death if you don't do it right, do what I want done right. So the astrologers, we can imagine, they was frustrated and upset at what was going on. Because here, the king is going to put me to death for nothing. I ain't did nothing wrong. And not only did he say just the ones I'm talking to, because here's where Daniel is kind of coming into the picture. I ain't going to just put all of the soothsayers and stuff to death that here I'm talking to me. I'm going to put all of y'all to death. And guess who was a wise man? Daniel. And the Hebrew boys. So they was caught up in that as well. So here we understand that the final response was in Daniel chapter 2 verses 10 and 11 here, and I think I already, no, I haven't read that yet. Here, let's read what it says here. We start with 9 and then we'll go there. But if you make it known to me the dream, but there is one decree for you, for you have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me till the time be changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I will shall know that you showed me the interpretation thereof. Verse 10. The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is no man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore, there is no king, lord, or ruler that asks such things as any magician, astrologist, or the Chaldeans. Verse 11. And if it is rare, it is a rare thing that the king requires that. And there is none other that can show it before the king, except the gods who dwell not in flesh. So the Chaldeans themselves go ahead now and admit we don't dwell with the gods either. So we can't tell you, king. And so here, what happens is they attempted to point out to the king, had never such a thing been asked before or explained, and it is impossible to do. So King Nebuchadnezzar was asking for something that was impossible to do. And once again, what was the impossibility thing that King Nebuchadnezzar was asking?
Interpretation.
Annie had a dream last night.
Interpretation.
Annie wants me to tell her what she dreamed, first of all. She ain't even going to tell me what she dreamed about. And then want me to explain the dream. And I better be right.
That's right.
Because if I ain't right, off your head. So that is a hard pill. That's a hard task there. And so, therefore, no one had ever done that before. Verse 11. At this point, Nebuchadnezzar's rage exploded. His suspicion had been confirmed. All of these magicians, all these soothsayers, all these astrological people, and the Chaldeans all had been doing one thing to Nebuchadnezzar all these years.
Lying to him.
Shucking and jiving. They have been lying to him. And so, therefore, his astrologers were not able to communicate with the gods because they told him, said, hey, the only person that can tell you what your dream, what you dreamed last night were the gods, and the gods don't live among people. And so, therefore, as a result, Nebuchadnezzar ordered a mass execution there. Off would kill them all. The Babylonians astrologers was not the only ones that was in the king's crosshairs this morning. Because they were part of the king's group of wise men, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were also condemned to death too, as we go to verse 13 here. And so Nebuchadnezzar, outraged decree had set the stage for true divine intervention here. And so the king was about to encounter the one and true God here this morning. The only one who could provide the answers to the king's dilemma here. And so, verse 13 said this, and the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain as well. And so remember, back in chapter 1 of Daniel, God had given Daniel that soothing ability to talk to people, to convey the idea, to speak to people and get them to see his point of view. And so at this point, Daniel found himself needing to use that ability there. And so experts, have talked about all of this here. And so what we're looking at this morning, the experience in Babylon did contribute, they contributed a lot to the advancement in science and astrology, but all the human expertise has limits. All of our expertise has limits. Whether regardless of how we find the balance, it's important to incorporate the new advances in our lives, such as in medicine and in technology, while still recognizing that we as human beings are limited. We can only go so far. We can only do so much. Although we recently sent 4 people to the moon, circled around the moon, and brought them back safely, there are limits as to what they could do. They couldn't go much further than that because they had to carry oxygen and all this other stuff with them, and they couldn't, if they went too far, that was the limits of their technology there. And so we find that difficult situations sometimes are used to open the doors for God's miraculous intervention. And so here God is orchestrating this condition here for Daniel to come in and offer up the answer to the problem. Daniel's vision from God, and remember we said that there's a difference between a dream and a vision. A dream is when your mind reaches and grabs little bits and pieces of what you done did all that day or that week or whatever, and your body's at rest, but that mind is not resting. The mind is wide open, it's still running full tilt. And since it ain't got nothing else, it just reaches and gets those bits and pieces and put it together and join it together like that. Whereas a vision comes to you directly from God there. And so there's a difference. Expression and dependence. This chapters 2, verses 14 through 18, it says this here. We pick up at verse 14 here. Daniel's request. Then Daniel answered the counsel and wisdom to Iraq, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. The captain of the king's guard was saying, hey, king says, kill all you wise men, so I got a job to do today. I'm going to go out here and get started. And so, but he ran into Daniel, and Daniel asked him the question and said, and he asked, so he answered and said to Arok, the king's captain, why is the decree so hastily from the king? And so Arok said, made the thing known to Daniel. He explained to Daniel why the king was in such an outrage. And understand now, I'm sure we all have worked for people that had short fuses. You know, do it now, off with your head too. I want you to do it right now. I don't want to hear a second thought. Yes, Christina, I have a very short fuse on the 7th. You know, I'm a time-sensitive person. Except when I get up here, and then I ain't time-sensitive no more. But seriously though, there are people that are like that. And so he answered, and verse 15 says, he answered and said to Arok, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king that Arok made this thing known to Daniel? Verse 16, then Daniel went in desiring the king that he would give him time. Daniel, once again, had this smooth tongue that God had blessed him with, that went in, not only did he talk to the captain of the king's guard, but he's asked to go talk to the king. He said, hey, let me go talk to the king, because all of us in the same boat here. I'm going to get killed, and just like the rest of these wise men here. So then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time. He went in and requested time. And so, and then he would show the king the interpretation. Daniel went, here's where we as Christians come into this play part here. Right. Then, verse 17, Daniel went into his house and made the thing known to Hamershan, Meshach, and Ezra, his companions. And verse 18, then that they would desire mercies of gods of heaven concerning his secret. In other words, what Daniel did was he went and got with his friends and said, okay, look, we need to go down in prayer. We need to go to God and about this situation here. We need to talk to God and find out, God, what it is that you need us to do. And that's important.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, before I go and buy this Corvette that me and Willie have been talking about for years and years and years,
yeah,
you probably need to go and ask God, God, is a Corvette what me and the bad needs really need? Or do we need something more practical? He probably said the price of gas, you probably don't even need one, period. But, therefore, that is what Daniel did. Daniel and the three Hebrew children went down in prayer. And it's important that we stop and realize Daniel's age. Daniel was what, about 17, 18 years old, somewhere along in there at that time. And I would imagine the other boys was about the same age. Now, which reflects back on their teaching. Somewhere prior to them getting brought into Babylon, they had been taught the Word of God. They had been taught to trust God. They had been taught that when the going get tough, the tough don't get going, the tough goes to God. And that's what they were doing. And so here in verse 18, that they would desire the mercies of God of heaven concerning his secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. And so here, verse 19, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. In other words, he thanked God that he had received the vision here. And so, verse 21, and he changed the times and the season. He removed kings and set it up kings, and he giveth wisdom to the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep secret things. He knows the things in the darkness, and the light dwelleth within him, with him. 23, I thank thee, and I praise thee, O God of my fathers, who has given me the wisdom and the might, that he might make known unto me now what we desire of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. So here David was, not David, Daniel was giving thanks unto God for making the vision known unto him, so that he could go to the king and give the interpretation there. And so here, Daniel's vision from God, which came in chapters 2, verses 14 through 18, discretion and dependence. There, as it says, there's a saying that goes, that is attributed to St. Augustine, that goes, work like it depends on you, and pray like it depends on God. And so this concept can help us navigate the tension between trusting God and working hard for God. Daniel's model this approach here. When he suddenly found that he was facing execution as well, he first used his God-given skills to navigate the political situation and then asked God for mercy here. So that's what Daniel did here. And so one thing we have to kind of keep in mind here, if you read through this here, the parallel somewhat between Daniel and Joseph.
Yeah.
So at the interpretation of dreams,
Right.
that Joseph found himself in a similar situation. He was in prison, and that he was interpreting dreams, and that was the thing that God used to bring him out of it. So quickly, fast forward in here, Daniel handled this crisis here in two stages. First, to better understand the situation and to buy some time, he confronted the executioner with wisdom and discretion. And wisdom and discretion. He didn't just go there and say, hey, look at here, head, the guy that was in charge of all putting the people to death. He used wisdom to talk to them, and discretion. That's why when you got back over here in this prayer of thanksgiving, when Daniel was giving thanksgiving, he was telling God, I thank thee and I praise thee, O God of my Father, who has given me wisdom and might, and hath made known unto me now that which we desire of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. Here. And so therefore, that was where Daniel got the understanding, the wisdom from God there. And we must understand and remember that. So Daniel asked his Hebrew friends to join him in praying that God would provide an answer to the king's questions in verses 17 and 18. They realized they were completely dependent on God's mercy there. And so the key here to understanding the king's question and the dilemma, that was the key. That was how they would understand the king's question and his dilemma there. So if we can understand or imagine that we all had a cup of water in one hand and a cup of gasoline in the other hand, how would you respond to a situation that could either put out a fire or add to the fire? You know, you got water in one hand and gas in the other hand, and you got a fire there, so which one are you going to throw on the fire? The water, to try to put the fire out. So that's what Daniel did by trying to calm things down when he went to the king and said, hey, king, give us a little time here. You know, I know you're upset, and I know you, them magicians and them sorcerers and all of them kind of rub you the wrong way. But give us a minute here, just calm down. You know, Unfortunately, nobody in Washington can say that to that man up there. Otherwise, we wouldn't be at war somewhere now.
Be adding
But
gas to it.
sometimes that is what we have to say. We have to say, leadership, kind of calm down. There's been plenty of times in my life when I know I was probably out of control. Full of rage. Christine, don't even forget. But something spoke and said, calm down. Step back, step away from it a little bit. And that's all Daniel was telling King Nebuchadnezzar was that, hey, King, I know you're upset. The king was, it said he was full of rage because they couldn't give him an answer. So all of that was revealed. And so here, what happened here, and so in that vision that night, God showed Daniel the king's dreams. Chapter 2, verses 19. Imagine the relief and the excitement that Daniel and his friends must have felt. They did not know how to wait, how long they had to wait for God to rescue them. The first thing Daniel was to praise the name of God. Throughout Daniel, the author often refers to him as God of the heaven. And so, but up to this point, there had been no mention of God's name. The phrase, the name of God, in verse 20 might be a little nod to the Hebrew readers as if they are to know the true name of God is in heaven. And what we have to understand now, understand where the Hebrew boys and the Israel children of Israel were at that point in time. They was in slavery. They were taken from Israel, from Judah, and was taken to Babylon as slaves. And this was the first group, which was the elite group. And later on, they went back and got everybody and put them in slaves as well. And finally, we get to verse 23 here, where Daniel connects to the great heroes of the old, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Ruth, Deborah, and David is the same God speaking to Daniel hundreds of years later. That's the same God. The same God that spoke to Abraham is the same God that's speaking to Daniel right now, as we understand. Any revelation that people receive about a deep and mysterious thing in verse 22 will come from him. Remember, the Chaldeans said it themselves. Only God can tell what's in a man's mind, what's on a man's mind. We can't tell it. So that's when they knew that they was in trouble there. And so Daniel stood before the king. And so, excuse me. And so we go to verse 24, where Daniel is standing before the king here. And therefore, Daniel went in unto Anra, who is the king, whom the king had ordained to be destroyed, the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus unto him, destroy not the wise men of Babylon before me and before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. And so Anra brought in Daniel before the king in haste. He was in a hurry because people was finna die there. And said thus unto him, I have found a man in the captives of Judah that will make known unto the king the interpretation here. So here we see, if you look at the big picture, you see how God is orchestrating this thing here. The children of Israel sinned. Let's be honest and explain how Daniel got to Babylon in the first place. Sin. They started to worship idol gods. They got away from worshiping the true and living God. So God had to chastise them. But at the same time, he's using a bigger picture here, because he's going to teach even the Babylonians about the God of heaven, as they was referring to it at that point in time. And so the same thing has to happen to us. A lot of times we find ourselves going through things because of something that we done sin or come short of the glory of God in it. But at the same time, going through it, we're going to produce a better person for not only ourselves, but the people that surround us. See, that's what, yes, sir.
Oh, no, go ahead. Finish what you were saying.
Go ahead.
Oh, so Daniel's name was Belshazzar?
Belshazzar, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. They, see, in chapters 1, when they first brought him up out of Judah into Babylon, the first thing the king God did was he said, okay, you can't be running around here with these Jewish names anymore. We're going to give you good Babylon names and change your name. Just like, you know, I use this analogy, you know, when we were slaves and I was on Mr. John's farm over here, working over here, and Mr. John said, well, I got too many black guys over here, so I'm going to sell a couple of them, sell some to Mr. Rodolph over here. And so when they sold me over there, my name was John over there. When I got over here, he said, well, I got a John. I got 2 or 3 Johns already, so I'm changing your name to Frank. Guess what? Being a slave, you can't sit there and say, oh, no, that ain't working. My mama named me Frank, and I'm staying Frank. No, you're changing your name. So that's what happened there. And so here, kind of fast forward, because the time is running out. Daniel interpreted the dream. He went into, and the dream, verse 36, we're skipping ahead here to verse 36. This is the dream, and we shall tell the interpretation thereof to the king. Daniel's talking to the king. Thou, O king, art the king of kings, for the God of heaven has given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. So, therefore, that's what Daniel's talking to Nebuchadnezzar. And wherefore, wherever the children of men dwell, and beasts of the field, and the fowls of the heaven, and has given unto thine hand, and has made thee ruler over all of them. Thou art the head of gold. In other words, he's telling Nebuchadnezzar that you are, right at this point in time, you the top, you the king of kings. You the head of gold. And then he goes on to say, and after thee shall arise another kingdom, inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, and shall bear rule over all the earth. And so, because of me and time falling out here, Daniel goes on to explain that in this image that Nebuchadnezzar dreamed it was an image of a king, of an individual that, well, I guess you could use the terminology individual, because the head was gold, the neck, the shoulders and the arms and the chest part was made out of silver, which was next to highest in gold. And then you had the thighs and the legs was out of bronze, and then you had the leg part that was out of iron. And then in the feet you had was a mangle of iron and clay that was together. But out of the mountain came a stone that was not cut by hand, that was used to destroy this image here. It destroyed the head, it destroyed the feet out of merry clay, and the mangle with iron. It destroyed the iron legs, it destroyed all the whole thing. And it goes on to say that once it had destroyed it, it was like the chaff on the wheat floor. It just blew all away. But this stone turned into the biggest stone in the world. And so here what the scripture is saying is that God destroys kingdoms. He sets them up and he takes them down. And that his kingdom, which was the stone that destroyed all other kingdoms, that turned them into chaff, but his kingdom took over the whole world. And therefore, this is future that Daniel was predicting, that God is going to take over and rule the whole world. And so here, that is where it was telling us here. A God of gods here, verse 44, I have to skip ahead, and said that the king Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face after hearing not only the dream, but the interpretation. Because what Daniel did was he told him, this is what you dreamed, was this image of gold head and the silver shoulders and the brass stomach and the iron legs and the feet made out of marble clay with iron in it. This is what you dreamed. And this is what it means. It means that all the kingdoms of the world are going to come under subjection unto God, and that he's going to destroy them, but at the same time, his kingdom will live forever. And so that is what the dream was, and that is what it boils down to. And so here we have to, chapters 2 of Daniel reminds us that God speaks through those who are devoted to him. God speaks to those who are devoted to him. And we all know people who need the help, need the hope of Jesus that Jesus offers. So ask God to speak through us to them. That's important that we understand that. And so here, if you can come away with anything this morning, we probably want to sit down and look at and make a list of some of the things that we worry about, and ask God to give you the big picture of the perspective. Here I am worrying about X, Y, Z, and not realizing that God has the whole world under his control. So I have no need to worry. That's what it's really getting down to here. And so it's important that we understand that. And with that point, I thank you for your time and your attention this morning, and we turn it over to Pastor Lewis. Thank you, Facebook.
Good word, good word. What's so important, guys, for us to remember, I think what Brother said is, you know, God is not a God far away, but he's a God that's close at hand. And he is concerned about every detail of our life. Every detail. And so many times we look and we think, God don't know, God doesn't seem like he's answering. But just like he answered Daniel, that was a very difficult thing for Daniel to go to God with, but not for God. For us, it seemed impossible. But every detail of the dream, God gave it to them. And then he also gave the interpretation. You know, there was a man by the name of Jack Deere, and he had a prestige position at Dallas Theological Seminary. And y'all have heard of that, where Dr. Tony Evans had graduated from. He was, I think, one of the first blacks and stuff to get a lot from there. But nevertheless, he taught that God did not any longer speak through dreams and visions. But while Dr. Deere was counseling the students, he heard the voice of God. And his life was forever changed. He writes about the experience in the book that surprised by the voice of God. He taught the students so that he no longer speaks through dreams, interpretation, or to his people. But he heard the voice of God, and his whole life was changed. Each of us have to have a personal experience with God for ourselves. God used counselors, he used preachers, he uses teachers, but I want you to know they can never take the place of God speaking to you personally. When you read, when you pray, when you study, when you get into a situation that don't seem like there's no peace, he will speak to you personally. He said, if you seek me with your whole heart, what did he say? You will find me. Because I'm not a God that's far away, but I'm a God that's close at hand. A lot of times we say, you won't hear me, you won't hear me. He hears you. You keep praying. And I promise you, he will send the answer. He will send the answer. It might not be the answer you want, but if he sends the answer, you say, God, make me willing to accept what you allow in my life. When we don't know God, we are just floundering. We are going through so many things. But if we ask God, quiet my spirit, God, speak to me. I need an answer. I promise you, he will answer. He is a faithful God, and he speaks